It's a fun event.
Had a great time.
Time well spent.
Very well organized, well-oiled machine.
I really learned a lot in a very short period of time.
Good morning, everybody. Ooh, that's loud. All right, so how do you wield intelligent threat intelligence? And I love this word, wield. I gotta thank Sam in the back for that one. Just like any weapon, so think about a set of nunchucks, for example. If you don't know how to use it and you don't train on how to use it, you're very likely to hit yourself in the face. So threat intelligence, very much like that, is you have to be able to curate it and you have to learn what its fallacies are, where it excels, and how to handle it in your environment to use it effectively. So threat intelligence is definitely tracking internal threats and external threats. It's really that data that's out there that allows you to proactively know when something is going to come down the pipe that could impact your organization negatively. It's going to tell you ahead of time that something's suspicious or that something should not be occurring. And this is comprised of a lot of different components. So the first piece is indicators of compromise, IOCs. I'm going to go through the differences between open source as well as high fidelity feeds. People, process, and technology. So I'll hit you with a buzz phrase, I guess, there. We want to go over some internal intelligence, which is often overlooked and ignored, and you have all this data at your fingertips, and just try to learn how to leverage that to help protect your organizations, as well as tactics, techniques, and procedures, which is really that behavioral element. So your IOCs are data points. It's going to be an IP address, a domain, something that at one point in time was isolated and was determined to be malicious. Your TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures, is your behaviors. So when somebody does one thing, they're probably going to do this other thing afterwards. So you're going to know what's going to come after it and what's going to come before, and it does help with your investigations. So let's go over feeds a little bit. I'm going to try not to rail too much on open source feeds, but it's kind of like jelly beans in this case, where you get a bag, you're really excited, you're digging in, you're having all your favorite flavors, and then you get a black licorice one. So in this case, you have a lot of degrees of separation from your source. A hobbyist, a security researcher, somebody's automated sandbox somewhere is just pushing stuff out. What happens is because there's really not a high level of oversight to that data coming into a feed, and it's coming from the community and it's crowdsourced, which is great. It makes it volumetric and you see things from all sorts of different organizations in that respect. You also get things like Google's Quad 8 DNS ending up in a feed or localhost ending up in a feed, which is going to cause a false positive headache for everyone on your SOC if that occurs. So that's where really these can be problematic. The other piece is that you end up with a lot of stale data. So this stuff gets crowdsourced, it gets thrown in there, but it's not maintained, it's not curated. There's an automated process that just is adding new stuff in, and stuff never gets aged out. So an IP address that was bad because one domain on it was bad back in 2013, that's in your feed now. There might not be that domain registered on it anymore. The domain might have been cleaned up. Your user might have had traffic to that IP address, but a totally unrelated domain in that case. If anyone's ever looked at who is on a GoDaddy IP address, you realize there's hundreds of domains associated with one IP. So if there's legitimate sites that your users are going to on a daily basis that's hosted on that IP, because the way open source feeds work, it can be very difficult to tune that out, so to tune out that noise. You don't really have control over the feed itself to be able to say, hey, I don't want to see this anymore. Often it's a whitelisting or exclusion approach in your alerting tool, and even that can be a little cumbersome depending on the tool. So as you can see from this structure, this is kind of what I'm painting the picture of, right? You have multiple sources of, you have no idea where that's coming from sometimes, or if you do, you don't have the ability to communicate with that party. It's pumping a bunch of IOCs into other feeds and they get aggregated. So with an aggregated feed, you're having a lot of different things, and it just makes it even harder to determine that source. If you can't determine the source, it's even harder to determine context around why is this indicator in this feed. So paid feeds, I'm specifying paid here, but I really mean non-open source feeds. So high fidelity feeds, private feeds, so if you're buddies with a researcher and they have a private honeypot or something to that effect, and they're allowing you access to it, you'll see a lot of researchers will just share data amongst themselves to avoid the community sourcing problem. So, come away from just commercial ideas, but this is anything that's non-community source. So one thing to look at though, if you are purchasing one of these types of feeds, is that OSINT IOC duplication. What you can sometimes find is they'll charge you an exorbitant amount for a paid feed, and it's actually just being fluffed out with virus total information, stuff that you can get from abuse.ch or some free source. You're essentially paying for stuff that you can get free somewhere else. So this is the big thing that I want to stress, because this has been problematic, especially as more people come to market, that they don't have a lot of analysts, or they don't have a lot of unique samples that they're churning through and pushing out. They will try to bulk out their indicators with stuff that's freely available to you elsewhere. That can also create ticket duplication, of course, which is another problem. So they can be a little bit hard to select. If you have one that's sourcing global data, maybe you're not a global corporation. You just need to know what threats are impacting the United States or healthcare or finance specifically. So you're paying for a lot of data that might not be relevant to your organization at all. They can also be hard on your budget, like I mentioned. They can sometimes be quite expensive. So the vetting process is very important. To take a look, crack it open, take a look and see what is actually inside of that data. Where threat intelligence platforms can kind of come in, so called tips, they allow you to be able to see that stuff inside. So instead of pulling down a giant CSV or text file and going through it manually, this can allow you to kind of parse through things and take a look at the types of indicators that are in something, as well as cross-correlate against other feeds you might have. So you can take a look for if there's anything being duplicated from open source. And on top of this is trusted circles. So I referred those private feeds, right? So if you have analysts on staff that are part of smaller Intel communities, or they've come from an Intel provider prior or something to that effect, prior military, the trusted circles are going to probably be your best bet to get high fidelity feeds for no cost or low cost. So you're going to be paying for some storage and maybe some technologies to integrate, but you're not going to be paying for that data itself, because it's coming from that impetus of information sharing, where people just want to defend organizations, and it's not a commercial venture for them. Where this is beneficial is you really get this direct path from the source, which you can easily identify, into your tooling. So if there is a problem like, hey, 127.0.0.1 is really super malicious and we're going to tell you about it, you can go back to the source and say, you need to clean this process up because this should never come into my feed again. So the important part here is measuring your return on investment for feeds. And this can be difficult and problematic and a little bit time consuming, to be frank, for most organizations. One way to be able to do this while you're vetting feeds in your organization is to actually look at your case management platform or your ticket platform and just simply look at your false positives versus true positives. So if you have a feed that has never given you a true positive hit, you're paying for it, stop paying for it. Pure and simple. Find that information somewhere else. If you're getting something that's giving you some really good true positive hits, but a lot of false positive noise, maybe you can find that true positive data somewhere else. Maybe that's coming from some subset of that intelligence data that'll be more beneficial, and you can get rid of all that extra noise. So I kind of recommend the first 6 months to a year approximately of starting this type of exercise or turning on a new feed, to look at the month to month and track those numbers, give yourself some trend analysis data, and then once you kind of have a feel of which feeds work best in your organization, you can kind of move that to annual. Another thing to look at is how many alerts per day can your analysts actually handle. So, I know for myself, I'm probably on 10 different listservs, and I've got automated things and automated feeds going to multiple tools and all these things. It's noisy. It's very hard to get that visual on one thing and to see it all in one place. So your analysts are dealing with the same thing. They're just getting peppered with this stuff. And what you want to avoid is that they're getting these alerts for something that might be valid, and they're just dumping it in an inbox rule and they're putting it into a folder to read later, and then they never look at it. So take a look at those things that are the highest fidelity, the most effective for your organization. Something else that I've found is often intelligence will get buried in other tooling. So email is a perfect example for this. You're going to have reputation blacklists that are probably plugged into that. When you're evaluating the feeds in your organization, don't forget those ones. Is it that this feed is blocking so many legitimate emails that you actually had to turn it off in that case? And I have had clients that have had to do that, and they basically had an email gateway with no reputation blacklist on it anymore because it was blocking 4,000 legitimate emails a day. Well, that's not useful to you. Reevaluate that tool at that point because it's just not giving you what you need. Firewalls are a good case too here, is that sometimes they'll come packaged with some sort of intelligence. It might just be as simple as this domain belongs to this category, or it can be something more developed like these IPs or this domain is part of a botnet versus adware, or something that's a little more granular in that case. It might not be able to be something you can just pull out and look at by itself. You're kind of having to view that data within the firewall, but it's also an important part of your intelligence program. You want your people to understand what that context is, so when they're getting an alert from it, they know how to handle it because they understand the source of that indicator or that intelligence. The last piece is reducing your dwell time. So dwell time is the time from attack to when you've detected it. So how well does that feed or that intelligence source, even if it's not automated, so emails, descriptions, white papers, it can be any intel source. How often does that actually help reduce that dwell time and how long an attacker is in your environment? Does it help reduce the number of major breaches or incidents that you have to report per year? Make your compliance department much more happy, those types of things. So those are different types of metrics that you can use to measure the value of the intelligence you're already using. So let's dig into people and process a little bit. So as I already mentioned, as you all know in this room, time is the most scarce resource really for security professionals. And this is going to impact the way you can deal with intelligence, especially when you're kind of getting started or you start realizing you want to vet this information. It can be time consuming up front, but it's going to have cost savings and time savings down the road. So it's important for your analysts and your team to understand context. And that comes from anything from how do I vet an IOC? If I see an IP indicator and it's saying I have malware C2 traffic, how do I go back and say, where did that IP come from? Oh, okay, it came from abuse.ch. Maybe I got it from somewhere else, but ultimately it was abuse.ch. I run a quick Google search on it. Then you pull it up, where that feed had originated, that IP originated in that feed. You realize that it was 2016. There was some domain that was delivering ransomware. It was hosted on there and it hasn't done anything bad since. In that case, that alert is a false positive more than likely. So learning those different tricks of finding where it came from, and truth be told, with an IP or domain, Google it with double quotes around it, you're gonna get all sorts of information on the context of an indicator. It's probably the most low-hanging fruit you can do for vetting an IOC. The other things that I find is helpful for analysts to understand is why would you automate in some contexts and why would you not automate in some contexts? So what you really want to get away from is your team just getting inundated and being like, oh, you won't stop sending me these emails. You won't stop sending me these alerts. Please, please stop. And if they understand why those items can't be just plugged into a tool, or why it can't be automated, why they still have to manually handle that intelligence, whether it's that it's prone to false positives, maybe it's a sensitivity issue where you can't have it available to your entire IT team. So having them be informed as much as possible about why you're making those decisions is also helpful. So we discussed a little bit about handling false positives, but this really comes down to, how do they handle that piece of data? Understanding exactly what to do with it and why they're being told something's bad. So they're not spending hours drilling down on something that turns out to just be an ad traffic or a content delivery network or something to that effect. So getting into the technology pieces, as I mentioned, there's all sorts of different types of intelligence. So the ones that everyone in the room is probably traditionally aware of is your hashes and your network indicators. But there's other IOC types too. So it might be a Bitcoin wallet or a bank routing number, an email address. a weird username that's hiding in strings in memory. There's all sorts of indicator types out there. Your tooling's not going to be able to handle all of those in most cases. There's some that are very, very nuanced, and it's possible that you're paying for that information, but if you can't effectively leverage it or you don't understand why you're getting that information, you're having stuff that you're not able to use, and it's just sitting there. So the different types of technologies where you're really going to find intelligence is your SIM. You're going to have correlation rules. There's often times where stuff's just automatically going into that. In those cases, you make sure you have the rules on. So we see a lot of customers that'll say, oh yeah, I love intelligence. Let me turn all these feeds on and click enabled all throughout. They never build a correlation rule or an alerting rule on it, and they never know when something happens. Or they turn on alerting for all of them, and 500,000 alerts later, they realize that they probably should have gone and done a slow roll on that. So your firewall is another place that you're often going to find intelligence buried. Your endpoint detection and response agents is a good place to find it. Email is often overlooked, and this is a great way to be able to defend against subject lines that you might not want to see. So, your janitorial staff, should they be getting invoices or emails with the term invoice in it at work? Probably not, for the most part, unless it's a manager or somebody that's making purchasing decisions. So these are types of things you can do to look and actually groom out this stuff from even coming into your environment. So let's talk about internal intelligence for a second. So internal intelligence is really all that data you already have at your fingertips. It's going to be in all sorts of different tooling. It might just be tribal knowledge in some cases, but these are things that can tell you who's already trying to attack you, who already might be attacking you, and that information is just going to be buried in pools of data. So looking at things like insider threats, something, this is my big buzzword, so user behavioral analytics, UBA, as you probably have heard of. That's something that'll look at, say, okay, well, this user always logs in from 9 to 5, and they do a couple of things, and they go home to feed their dog, and all of a sudden they're having a large data transfer at 3 a.m. So that's the type of thing that internal intelligence is, that 9 to 5 piece, and looking for that anomaly is that 3 a.m. piece. So leveraging that type of data, build those alerting use cases based on what different departments, divisions, geographical regions are doing in your organization, and leverage that. Talk to the IT guy that's been there 20 years. If that's not you, find the person who it is, because they're going to know what printer is going to do the weird thing that's going to cause a false positive. That's all internal intelligence that can actually help you weed out the noise and find the real threats in your organization. Something else to look for is reconnaissance. So most people won't alert when their firewall blocks something. All that's telling me is my firewall is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But if you know who's scanning you, and it's not your typical Rapid7 or Shadow server or something to that effect, maybe there's that one dude that's coming from a different country that's kind of trying to mix, blend into those normal scanners, but maybe it's just one IP and you're seeing it the same day every month. Something to that effect. That's reconnaissance, and that can let you know who's trying what ports are they trying, what services are they looking for, are they pulling down banners, do they have a weird user agent that you can block, those types of pieces that can kind of get buried because they're not typically being alerted on. Something else that often gets missed is website referrer data. So this could be something like all of a sudden somebody's pulling down your logo with a curl user agent or something to that effect. Or a random site is pulling it down as a remote resource. Well, why would another website other than yours need your logo? That's saved data. It's a lot to slough through, but that's the type of data that you have at your fingertips that's probably not being actively utilized in your organization. And then going down to anomaly detection, it's not just looking for users doing weird things. There's obviously the network anomalies that two hosts have always just talked to each other, and all of a sudden somebody is talking out to Taiwan or something to that effect. So, again, using that tribal knowledge, knowing what your technology should be talking to, what applications talk on which ports, and then looking for when that's no longer occurring or something's changed. Now, we talked all about sourcing. Where is all this intelligence? You have all this stuff inside, you have all this stuff out in the wild you can grab. You're gonna have to figure out where to put all that. So storage can be an issue in some cases, so that's why I kind of recommend doing this as an iterative process where you go through slowly if you're just getting started. But being aware that you're gonna want this stuff probably in one place as best you can, but it's gonna grow and it's gonna grow, and sometimes you can't pull down everything you want or store it because you just don't have the space. The big thing is being able to query it. So whether it's via API or a GUI, a search box, whatever it is, you have to be able to have your analyst put an IP address in there and find out everything you already know about it. The last piece about internal intelligence is utilize your lessons learned activities after an incident and actually look at that stuff over time. Instead of just having a team meeting, going through that particular incident, and then moving on to the next fire, have either a quarterly, biannually, whatever you need, where you go through and say, hey, what are the last 5 breach reports we had? What do we keep getting impacted by? If this is the 6th imitate infection that you've had, you're probably not doing everything you can to detect imitate ahead of time. So those are things that in the mire of daily work that can kind of get lost. You're just on to the next thing, but take that time and go through your team and see what you're already looking at. So the last thing I want to touch on is the tactics, techniques, and procedures. So I've talked a lot about indicators at this point, and we've all dealt with false positive floods at one point in our career, if not multiple times. Where TTPs really come in is that understanding of what a threat is going to do, what an actor is going to do, or a specific malware type, and it's probably going to do that every time. So an example here would be like WinWord spawning WScript. Maybe you don't have a tool that ever does that, so it should never occur. So either setting alerts or having blacklisting involved, and where it just can't even spawn that. That's the type of thing where the behavior will let you know, hey, these 2 things should never occur in tandem. Doesn't matter what IP address delivered it, what country it came from, what format it came from. These 2 things should never occur together. And that's really where your TTPs are coming in. The other piece is you have to stay on top of that. So going back to the imitate example, that thing changes its TTPs once a month. So it went from just being kind of noisy in a botnet and I was sending out macro docs to having XML attachments, to having zip attachments, to having links again in the body of the email. It used to just go and drop something else. Now it will steal all the emails off an infected host. You might want to know that before you're going into a forensic investigation and having to report what's going on. So just understanding where these things fit in, knowing how to threat hunt in those gaps if you know that your tooling or your intelligence visibility isn't in a spot, and be able to iterate over those areas. And that's pretty much it.